The lawyer slid the folder across the table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Rachel, I think you should sit down for this part." And that's when I knew my sister had been lying to me for 3 years, because the will in front of me wasn't the will my mother had shown me the summer before she died. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't hold the pages steady, and across the table, Danielle wouldn't look up from her phone, and that single detail told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. 6 weeks earlier, I had buried my mother in a cemetery outside Asheville in North Carolina, wearing a black dress I bought in a hurry because grief doesn't wait for you to plan your outfit, and I had believed, foolishly, that the hardest part of this whole ordeal was already behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part hadn't even started. Because 2 days after the funeral, I sat in a lawyer's office and learned that my mother's entire estate, her house on Chestnut Ridge Road, her antique shop downtown that she'd built from nothing over 22 years, and nearly $400,000 in savings and life insurance, had all been left to my sister. Not split between us. Not even a token gesture toward the daughter who had moved back to Asheville 4 years earlier to become our mother's full-time caregiver. All of it, to Danielle, who lived 3 states away in Charlotte and visited twice a year, at Christmas and, if we were lucky, Easter. I sat frozen while the attorney read the language out loud, and I remember thinking, this has to be a mistake, this has to be some kind of clerical error, because my mother and I had talked about the will just 8 months earlier, at her kitchen table, over decaf coffee, and she had told me, in her own words, sitting right across from me, "Rachel, the house is yours, and we'll split the shop and the savings evenly between you and your sister. You've earned this. I want you to know that." I remembered every word of that conversation because it was the first time in years my mother had made me feel like the invisible daughter finally mattered. And now, sitting in that office, that promise had evaporated into nothing, replaced by a legal document dated just 5 weeks before she passed, a document I had never seen, never been told about, and apparently never needed to know existed until it was too late to ask her why. That night, I drove to my mother's empty house, sat in my car in the driveway for almost an hour, and made a decision that would define the next 4 months of my life. I wasn't going to cry in front of my sister. I wasn't going to beg the lawyer to reconsider. I was going to find out exactly how a will that contradicted everything my mother had told me came into existence 5 weeks before her death, when by that point she could barely sign her own Medicare paperwork without my help. Because here's the detail nobody in that office seemed to notice but me: my mother had advanced rheumatoid arthritis in both hands for the final 2 years of her life. She hadn't signed a legible signature in longer than that. I had watched her struggle to sign birthday cards. And yet the new will bore a signature so clean, so uniform, that it looked like it belonged to a woman 20 years younger. That same week, I quietly went back to the house under the excuse of collecting some of my mother's clothing for donation, and while I was there, I opened the drawer of her writing desk, the one she used for bills and correspondence, and found a business card for a notary public named Gregory Howlenbeck, with an office address in Charlotte, not Asheville, where my mother lived her entire adult life and where every other legal document she'd ever signed had been notarized. That was the first crack. My mother didn't know anyone in Charlotte. My sister did. My sister had lived there for 9 years. I want to be honest with you about something before I go further, because I think it matters to understanding why this hurt as much as it did. This wasn't the first time Danielle had been treated like the center of the universe in our family, and it wasn't the first time I had quietly absorbed being treated like an afterthought. Growing up, Danielle was the daughter who got the piano lessons, the cheerleading uniforms, the new car for her 16th birthday. I got hand-me-downs and a part-time job at 15 to help with groceries, because my mother said I was the responsible one, and Danielle was the sensitive one, as if responsibility wasn't its own kind of exhausting sensitivity nobody ever noticed. When our father left when I was 12, I was the one who helped Mom figure out the mortgage payments. Danielle was 14 and got to stay a child. I don't say any of this looking for sympathy. I say it because you need to understand that by the time I found that notary's card in the drawer, I wasn't just angry about money. I was angry about a lifetime of being the daughter who did the work and watched someone else collect the reward, and something in me finally refused to let it happen one more time. If you've ever sat in a family gathering and felt invisible while somebody else got all the credit for things you did the real work on, I want you to stay with me through this story, because it does not end the way you think it will, and it holds a lesson I promise you will not forget. But first, subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories if you've ever been the overlooked one in your own family, because these are the stories about the quiet ones who finally stopped staying quiet, and I have a feeling you already know exactly which chapter of your life this story is going to remind you of. My name is Rachel Whitfield. I'm 44 years old, and at the time all of this happened, I was living in a rented townhouse on the edge of downtown Asheville, working as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic, raising my 13-year-old son Owen mostly on my own since my divorce 4 years earlier. My mother, Margaret Whitfield, had been the one constant in my adult life, the person I called every single day, the person whose porch light I could see from 2 streets away when I drove home from her house late at night after helping her with dinner or her medications. My sister Danielle, 38, lived in Charlotte with her husband Craig, ran a moderately successful interior design consulting business, and had built a life around a carefully curated Instagram presence that made it look like she had everything under control, including, apparently, our mother's estate planning. The antique shop I mentioned, it was called Whitfield & Company, on Biltmore Avenue, a narrow storefront crammed with restored furniture, vintage jewelry, and estate pieces my mother had been collecting and reselling since I was in college. That shop wasn't just a business to her. It was the thing she built after our father left, the thing that put food on our table, the thing she was proudest of in her entire life. I had worked there every Saturday for 15 years, unpaid, because that's what daughters do when their mother needs help and there isn't money for real employees. Danielle had set foot in that shop maybe a dozen times in the last decade. So when I tell you that a will dated 5 weeks before my mother's death handed all of it, the house, the shop, the savings, to my sister, and left me with a formal note thanking me for my support during a difficult time, you can understand why I didn't sleep for a week straight. But grief has a strange way of making you doubt your own instincts, and for those first 10 days, I genuinely tried to convince myself that maybe my mother had simply changed her mind near the end, that maybe illness and morphine and fear had reshuffled her priorities in ways I wasn't there to witness. I tried to let it go. I really did. Right up until I found that notary card, and right up until I called the number on it, and a receptionist answered, Hallenbeck Notary and Legal Services, and mentioned, almost in passing, that Mr. Hallenbeck was actually a longtime family friend of a client named Danielle Whitfield Pierce. Now, if I stopped the story right there, you might already be furious on my behalf, and I don't blame you. But this is where the real fight began, because knowing something is wrong and proving it in a court of law are 2 very different battles, and I was about to learn that the hard way. If you've ever tried to go up against a sibling who has always been better at appearing innocent than actually being honest, you know exactly the wall I was about to hit. Stay with me, because the twist that came 4 minutes from now changed absolutely everything, and it involved a piece of evidence sitting in my mother's shop the entire time that nobody, not even Danielle, knew I had access to. I decided my first move had to be quiet. I wasn't going to confront Danielle directly, because I knew from 38 years of experience that confrontation with her always turned into her crying, playing the victim, and somehow making me apologize by the end of the conversation. Instead, I called an estate attorney named Patricia Nguyen, a woman my physical therapy colleague had used during her own father's estate dispute, and I laid out everything, the arthritis, the out-of-town notary, the contradiction with what my mother had told me 8 months prior. Patricia listened carefully, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, Rachel, contesting a will on the grounds of undue influence or forgery is one of the hardest cases to win, because courts assume competent adults have the right to change their minds. You need more than suspicion. You need documentation. So I built my case the way I'd built anything else in my life that mattered, methodically, quietly, without announcing a single move. I requested my mother's complete medical records from the final year of her life, and they confirmed what I already knew. By the date on that new will, my mother's rheumatologist had documented severe joint deformity in both hands, difficulty gripping a pen, and had recommended she use an adaptive stylus for even basic signatures. I obtained bank statements showing that 3 withdrawals, $2,000 each, had been made from my mother's account in the 6 weeks before her death, withdrawals my mother, in her weakened state, would never have had the energy or the clarity to authorize alone. I found the name of the second witness on the will, a woman named Carla Jensen, and after 2 days of searching, I discovered that Carla Jensen was Danielle's college roommate, now living conveniently in Asheville, working part-time doing exactly what, nobody could quite say. Here's the mini win, the first small taste of justice, because I know you've been waiting for it. I called Carla Jensen directly, introduced myself gently, and simply asked her to walk me through the day she witnessed my mother's signature, because I was helping settle the estate and wanted to make sure everything lined up correctly for the lawyers. Carla, who clearly had no idea she was one signature away from being an accomplice to fraud, nervously admitted that she had actually signed the document at Danielle's condo in Charlotte, not at my mother's house in Asheville, and that my mother wasn't feeling well enough to come to the door that day, so Danielle had simply brought the paperwork out to her afterward, already signed. Carla had never actually seen my mother put pen to paper. She had witnessed a signature that was already there. I hung up that phone call, sat down on my kitchen floor, and let myself cry for the first time in 3 weeks, not out of sadness this time, but out of the sheer, dizzying relief of finally having proof that I wasn't losing my mind. My mother hadn't changed her mind about me in her final weeks. She had never even seen that will. But knowing the truth and forcing a courtroom or a family to accept it are two very different fights, and the next part of this story is where it got personal in a way I never expected. Because Danielle wasn't just going to hand over a $400,000 inheritance because her sister had a hunch and a nervous phone call from a college roommate. She was going to fight, and fight dirty, and I want you to remember Carla Jensen's name, because she becomes important again in about 10 minutes, when the entire scheme finally collapses in front of a judge who had absolutely no patience left for excuses. If this story is already making your blood boil, that's exactly why I make these videos, because too many of us have sat quietly while a sibling or a parent rewrote the story of who deserved what, and too many of us said nothing because we were taught that keeping the peace mattered more than the truth. It doesn't. Subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories now, because the next chapter of this one is the reason people say quiet women are the most dangerous people in any family to underestimate. I brought everything to Patricia, my attorney, and she filed a formal will contest in Buncombe County Probate Court on grounds of undue influence and suspected forgery, citing the medical records, the unexplained bank withdrawals, and Carla Jensen's account of never witnessing an actual signing. Within a week, Danielle called me for the first time since the funeral, and the conversation was exactly what you'd expect from someone cornered and unwilling to admit it. She accused me of being jealous, of never having let go of childhood resentments, of trying to smear our mother's memory by suggesting she'd been manipulated. She said, and I quote this because I will never forget it, "Mom loved me more because I gave her less to worry about. Maybe if you'd stop being so bitter, you'd understand that." I said very little in response. I simply told her that the courts would decide what they decided, and I hung up, because I had learned by then that Danielle only escalated when she had an audience reacting to her, and I refused to give her one anymore. The court proceedings took nearly 3 months, and during that time, Danielle hired an aggressive attorney of her own, a man who tried, at every turn, to paint me as a bitter, overlooked sister inventing a conspiracy out of jealousy. He brought up my divorce, suggested I was financially desperate, implied that a caregiver daughter resenting her golden child sibling was a common, almost expected motive for fabricating exactly this kind of accusation. For a while, sitting in that courtroom, I felt the same invisible daughter shame creeping back in, the same feeling I'd had my entire childhood of being disbelieved simply because Danielle was better at performing sincerity than I was at simply being sincere. Then Patricia called Gregory Hallenbeck, the notary, to testify, and this is the moment the entire case turned. Under oath, facing the very real threat of losing his notary license and facing perjury charges, Hallenbeck admitted that he had never actually met my mother, had never verified her identity in person as required by North Carolina notary law, and had notarized the document based solely on Danielle's assurance that her mother's signature was authentic, because, in his words, Danielle told me her mother was too weak to travel, and I trusted a longtime client. He had violated the most basic requirement of his entire profession, and Danielle had known it when she asked him to. And then Carla Jensen took the stand, and this time, under oath, with a judge staring her down, she couldn't hedge the way she had on the phone with me. She confirmed, on record, that she signed as a witness at Danielle's condo in Charlotte, that my mother was never present, and that Danielle had told her, quote, "It's just a formality, Mom already agreed to everything, we just need the paperwork to catch up." That single sentence, "we just need the paperwork to catch up," was the moment the judge's expression changed from neutral to unmistakably skeptical, because it confirmed exactly what Patricia and I had been arguing all along: there was no legitimate signing. There was only a document manufactured to match a story Danielle had already decided was true. Here's the second attention anchor I promised you, because the final twist in this story isn't just that Danielle lost the will contest, it's what the judge discovered when he ordered a full forensic handwriting analysis, comparing the signature on the contested will to 11 verified signatures of my mother's from medical consent forms across the final 2 years of her life. I'm going to tell you exactly what that analysis revealed in just a few minutes, and it is the single most damning piece of evidence in this entire case, the moment that turned a family dispute into something the district attorney's office started asking questions about. The forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Elaine Foster who had testified in probate cases across 3 states, spent 6 weeks analyzing stroke pressure, letter formation, pen lift patterns, and signature consistency. Her final report concluded, with what she called a high degree of scientific certainty, that the signature on the contested will did not match my mother's authenticated signatures from the same time period in ways consistent with her documented arthritis, and instead showed characteristics consistent with tracing or careful replication by a second party. In plain language, someone had copied my mother's old signature, likely from an earlier document, rather than my mother signing it herself. When Dr. Foster read that conclusion aloud in court, I watched Danielle's face for the first time since the trial began, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw my sister look genuinely, completely afraid. The judge invalidated the will entirely, ruling that it failed to meet the legal standard for a valid execution due to both the notary's admitted failure to verify identity and the forensic evidence of signature replication. Because that will was thrown out, the court reverted to my mother's prior valid will, the one drafted 3 years earlier, the one that, just as she had promised me at her kitchen table, split the estate evenly between Danielle and me, with the house designated specifically to go to me, since I was the one still living nearby and the one who had cared for her. The judge additionally referred the matter to the district attorney's office to determine whether criminal charges for fraud and forgery were warranted against my sister and against Gregory Hallenbeck for notary misconduct. I did not celebrate that day. I want to be honest with you about that, because revenge stories often make it sound like winning feels like triumph, and for me, mostly, it felt like grief all over again, grief for a sister I had lost long before any of this began, grief for a mother whose final months had apparently been shadowed by a scheme she never knew was happening around her. But underneath that grief, there was something else, something quieter and steadier, the relief of finally being believed. Of finally having proof, in black and white, that I hadn't imagined a lifetime of being the daughter who did the work while someone else collected the credit. The house on Chestnut Ridge Road is mine now. I kept the antique shop running, renamed it Margaret's, after my mother, and it's done better in the past year than it ever did before, because I run it the way she taught me to, with patience and honesty and an eye for things other people overlook. Danielle and I don't speak. I've made peace with that. Some relationships end not with a dramatic explosion but with a quiet, permanent closing of a door, and I've learned that closing that door was the healthiest thing I could have done for myself and for my son. If you've made it this far with me, I want to leave you with the same thing my mother's antique shop taught me over 20 years of watching her work. Some of the most valuable things in this life are the ones other people overlook, dismiss, or underestimate, and that includes you, and it included me, right up until the moment I refused to let anyone rewrite the truth of what I had earned. Before you go, subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories, because I have dozens more stories like this one waiting for you, true accounts of quiet people who stopped staying quiet and got the justice they deserved. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in my position, or tell me about the moment in your own life when you finally stopped being the overlooked one and started standing up for the truth, because I read every single comment, and your stories are the reason I keep telling mine.